Gosh, there's a lot of noise coming from out there. Hello. Hello. I'm going to talk today about the art of sharing. What we're talking about today in this session is the ability for us to share information about the threats that we're observing with other organizations without giving up anything that we're not already sharing with the outside world. Who in here is sharing threat information? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, so that's like 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to take that quiz again at the end of the session, and I think we're going to see a lot more people sharing than they think that they are. What I'm going to talk about today is I think the security market in general is coming around to a recognition of the fact that it's very important for us to understand what threats are affecting people across our particular industry and across the entire IT marketplace. And in order to do that, we have to be sharing information about the threats that we're getting hit with. And a lot of people are hesitant to do this because of privacy concerns. They're very worried about sensitive information getting leaked out, particularly about major intrusions. Major hackers that get into their network might steal a lot of data. They don't want to share that information until they're ready to share that information. There's a lot of PR involved in those types of threats. What we're going to talk about is a lower bar, lowering the bar for sharing to something that's more palatable across a wider base of organizations so that we can get a high level of usefulness with a very, very low risk of disclosure about that information. So my name is Roy Steffen. I'm from a company called Pierce Global Threat Intelligence. We're a cybersecurity product company that offers ways to share information across different models. I'm not going to give a corporate pitch. Just we're based out of Virginia, so we're a fairly local organization, and we have a large online global threat database that we can integrate with your log files and provide you information about malicious actors that are in your network. But I'm not here today to talk about my product. What I'm here today to talk about is the methodologies and the approach to privacy that we used behind our sharing mechanisms. So what first started out, we looked at the fact that systems administrators are very smart. People are configuring their networks to keep the bad guys out. They're not 100% successful. Nobody's 100% successful keeping the bad guys out. But if they let legitimate traffic be blocked, then they come under extreme pressure from their organizations to remediate those situations. So what we can tell is everything they let in isn't necessarily good by definition, but the things that they're blocking tends to be, on average, much worse than the goodness of the things they're letting in. Does that make sense? You can trust the things they're blocking better than you can trust the things that they're letting in. And that's because business practices won't let them block legitimate traffic, and if they do, not for very long. So what we're looking at is the information that gets blocked. The people that organizations know up front are malicious actors. The things that are happening on your network that are already known to be malicious to one organization that may not be known to be malicious to other organizations. So this comes down a lot to customizations. It comes down to whitelists. If people are picking up hackers and attackers because their firewalls, blanket policies are covering them, or because a signature analysis on an AV is covering them, that's not necessarily new information from a sharing information perspective to the rest of the network. What is interesting and what is unique from an information sharing perspective are that the hackers that are being stopped by your whitelist, your heuristics, the customizations that are done beyond the standard signatures and analysis. And that is where we can identify 0 days and where information sharing becomes extremely important and extremely valuable. As I said before, sharing is fairly tricky. There's a lot of sensitive personal information that's out there. There's a lot of people that are already sharing enormous amounts of sensitive information with the likes of Google and Facebook. They're doing this more in their personal lives than their business lives. But we've seen the value that people can derive from sharing information. And on a generational basis, what we're seeing is people are starting to be more comfortable with sharing information than they were, 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. What's interesting that happened with Edward Snowden, I think we're all familiar, everyone knows about the Snowden case, right? That's universal.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. So what Snowden highlighted, I don't think that many people should have been surprised. If anybody read the Patriot Act, they'd know what was going on. But what Snowden highlighted for everybody was the fact that there's a lot of information that's out there in the open. Your ISPs have a lot of information about you. A lot of your communications, particularly your meta information like your headers, to and from IP addresses are not encrypted, even if you're doing a VPN. There's still a lot of meta-level information that's available in the log files. Governments are making use of this. ISPs are making use of this. Global threat technologies are partnered with the ISPs. They're making use of this information, whether you want them to or not. It's not to say that they're stealing your credit card data or your sensitive healthcare information, but there is valuable information that's available and that's not being encrypted in all of our communications. So I ask the question again, how many people in here think that they're sharing information? Every one of you is sharing information, whether you want to or not. And when we think about sharing information, we think about actively doing it through a Google or Facebook or some other type of active sharing mechanism, perhaps an ISAC in the IT world. But what's come out and what's commonly known now is that organizations have their information being taken, being looked at, and being used globally. And what we talk about is, okay, that information is not encrypted, it's not secure. How can we take that information and get some utilization out of it ourselves? If we would really like to share and we would like to gain the benefits of that sharing, that information is already being used. How can we turn this around and use this information to gain some usefulness ourselves? If we're already sharing information, and I think after this slide we recognize that we are already sharing this information, no matter what the legal department says about it, no matter what executives think about it, at an IT level, we can recognize that our information is being shared widely already. Then we can take that information and we can use it for good. We can use it for our own purposes. We can use it to better protect ourselves through actively participating and actively sharing that information with each other. It's already out there in the wild. Did you have a question, sir, or are we just stretching? No? Okay. So when we look at sharing, we try to reduce this down to a previously solved equation. Good mathematics say somebody out there has already solved this, at least in pieces or in parts. We looked across a number of different organizations, a number of different systems where sharing is happening, where open data is being exchanged. We looked at the reasons why those systems have been successful, where so many people have a belief that they're not sharing, so many people have a belief that they're against sharing in their organizations. And what we saw is a number of different areas. Spam reputations, a lot of people are sharing who's spamming with them. They don't necessarily consider that sharing, but they are. They're sharing those IP addresses back into Cisco, back into FireEye, back into McAfee, and other organizations. Your signature analysis, not everybody contributes to the signatures, but there's a widely recognized methodology for creating generic signatures and being able to share that information back into the community without giving up a lot of sensitive information about attacks that may have worked or not worked against your organization. And when you look at something as simple as DNS requests, even being able to resolve an IP address into a host name or the reverse, depending on if you're doing a reverse lookup or a normal lookup, is still sharing information with the DNS system. You're still taking a bit of information about your communications. You're taking an IP address that somebody in your organization is going to this web server, and you're resolving a domain name into that IP address. All of that information is crossing the boundaries of your organization. So again, this is just several examples of the fact that we talk to companies every day that say, I don't share anything, legal will never let me share anything, there's no sharing that's happening in my organization. As much as I might like to benefit from a sharing network, they'll never allow me to share anything internally. And we have a number of situations here that organizations are sharing. I've sat down with legal organizations in many different companies and said, show me the legal agreement that you have with the DNS system. Well, what are you talking about? Well, there's IP addresses that are passing back and forth to the DNS every day. No, there isn't. We don't share IP addresses. We never share IP addresses. Well, I'm sorry, but if you have a network in your environment, you are sharing that. And let's start with that sharing as a basis for how we can maximize the utilization. So when I talk about what do these successes have in common, they're self-limiting. There are other technologies out there that like to grab every bit of information. When you look at the SIM world, when you look at some of the online log management systems, they're interested in grabbing all of your log information and being able to strife through it. They want PCAP packet capture. They want every aspect of your log files because, and from their perspective, the more data that they have, the more that they can see, the more value that they can add back to their customers. when we look at it, we say there's so many people that are against sharing that low-level information, against sharing all of that data, that those systems and those organizations are actually shortchanging themselves because they're asking for too much data. Because they're asking for too much data, too much sensitive information, they don't have enough people contributing to that system to really get a big data effect on the information and to really be able to derive the maximum value that they could if they self-limited. So the methodology that we're talking about today is, instead of pushing forward and trying to get from each one of the people in the system all of their information, restrict yourself to the information that they're already sharing or information that has very low value to the organizations. And that way you're able to maximize the number of organizations that are contributing to the network. And from a breadth perspective, you end up with a lot more information and a lot more usefulness from the information when you're trying to track things like global spread of botnets, and not just command and control, but the zombies and the actual active users. We looked for previous models where people were taking large amounts of information, self-limiting, and being able to share across wide swaths of the populace. And what we came up with was an approach called the RU confidentiality map. Has anybody ever heard of this? I doubt anybody in IT has ever heard of this. It's a statistical confidentiality chart used by the U.S. Census. This was developed for the 2000 census, I believe. And what they determined was, what information out of the U.S. Census are we allowed to publish publicly? Because as we collect information on all these households, there's a lot of sensitive data that we're collecting, and if we just publish every bit of information that we have, nobody's going to share, or people are going to lie, or we run into these other issues. So it's important as a government that we perform census for tax and voting reasons and all different types of reasons. And the challenge in front of census is how much of that data do we share back to the community, and which pieces of it have, as it says here, the maximum amount of utility, the most usefulness that we can get, while at the same time having the lowest risk of disclosure. So when you look at census, what they identified was a particular choke point right here, which was sort of the ideal position where they're getting the maximum amount of utility out of the data possible with the minimal amount of risk of disclosure. So we've applied that across the board to a number of different technologies that we're aware of in the marketplace. And don't hold me to exactly the placement here. This is our interpretation of what we've seen from the market and the reaction of the markets. I don't want Google or Facebook to come after me and sue me, but from our perspective, what we've seen is Census, of course, built the model, so by definition, they're at the choke point, and this is their model, so that's where we placed them. As we go up the stack, we see people that have higher levels of disclosure risk, more information that they're sharing, but they've drawn that line differently. So we've created more of a tolerance range where people are pretty okay with the way Microsoft does things. Facebook and Google sort of are right at the top of the tolerance range. And you can see when they go beyond the tolerance range, there's an outcry from the public. They set up a new option, they set up a new default, and they draw themselves back into the tolerance range. So over the last 2 years, you've been seeing a lot of Facebook and Google here popping out of that tolerance range and back in. And they try to operate right at the top of that range, as opposed to Census, who's trying to operate more at the bottom of this range. And then spying programs, right off the chart, they don't care. So when we looked at those technologies that I talked about on the last slide, we really found that the objective zone is here, sort of Census and below. If you really want to maximize people's comfort level with sharing their information, you need to self-limit yourself to the information that is below this tolerance range. And these are the technologies that have been successful. This is the DNS system we talked about. Even IP headers, right? People know that IP headers are unencrypted, and they still use the internet anyways. So that objective range is really right there. But there's something interesting going on with email right now. Email is sort of floating out of that range, which probably should have happened decades ago, but that's my personal feeling. So as an organization, we came up with a statement called privacy-protected crowdsourcing. It's a bit of an oxymoron. I think if you guys read the description, I said that. But what we mean by this privacy-protected crowdsourcing is We're identifying the pieces of your information that are already known, are already public. And we're looking at ways that we can share that information across the widest number of organizations so that they can be protected without the risk of disclosing any sensitive or legitimate business data out of your network. So removing from that communication and that coordination and sharing, removing any IP address, removing it like social security numbers, HIPAA information, person identifiable information that may be coming from packet level captures, taking all of that information out of the equation and saying, look, this is too sensitive and there's too low of a value for sharing that information. Let's look at the communication level. So let me give you a specific example of this. When you block somebody at your firewall, there could be any number of reasons why you're blocking at your firewall. Who in here collects that data on the people they block at their firewall? Right. We talked to a lot of organizations, and a lot of people didn't raise their hand. We talked to a lot of organizations that don't even look at that data. If it was a block, they just drop it on the ground and forget about it. They're much more concerned with the people that are getting into their network. The information sharing that we're talking about here looks at the things that are blocked in one organization's firewall, and if you block somebody, you block somebody, and you block somebody, and you let them in, it becomes very interesting to you that 100 other people blocked that guy that you're letting into your sensitive credit card database. And that's a way that we can prioritize your alerts and your warnings. You may be getting 100,000 red alerts an hour and trying to investigate and prioritize what's the worst of the worst. And by identifying and understanding that several other people have blocked particular communication that you're letting in, you may even have alerts and warnings about it. But as we saw on Target, there was several different systems that alerted and warned about this stuff, and it just never really got prioritized right. It never got respected by the management. To the last guy's talk, for those of you guys that were in here before, talking about CISOs in the boardroom, 11 out of the 13 board members at Target got let go because they ignored the warnings that were coming out. And that's why CISOs are getting in the boardroom, because people are getting fired over this now. And we haven't seen that in the past with technology breaches. It's sort of been limited to a technology problem, and now it's expanded out to be a true executive problem up into the boardrooms. And that's why we're seeing a lot more attention, and why Target was such a game changer. As an aside from the talk, we've all seen hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of attacks just like Target over the years. And there's always kind of a little bit of a reaction, a little bit of a jump in people paying attention in budgets, et cetera, maybe hire an extra guy. But the Target one is completely different, not because of the technology that was employed or the way the hackers work. It was completely different because of the effect that had in the boardroom. And that's why, I mean, personally, that's why I see Target as a game changer for security as an industry, because the pain is actually starting to be felt at those upper echelons. And I think the last guy's talk actually highlighted a lot of very good points around that particular aspect. So, anyways, that's what we mean by privacy protected crowdsourcing. And I think I'm going to jump ahead to the summary here because I'd like to have a few minutes. I know I'm the last person standing between you and lunch, so I feel that, and I know I'm not going to keep your attention too long here. But really, when we look at the last 10 years of business intelligence and big data analysis as it's come along, it's spent a lot of time trying to turn data into information. You've probably all heard that spiel, those sort of buzzwords. What we're looking at here is providing perspective, being able to take large amounts of data that may be overwhelming us in terms of alerts and warnings already, and adding perspective to that. Ironically, by adding more data. The problem to our data problem is more data, right? It's an interesting statement, but when you look at it from a perspective aspect, the fact that we have tons of alerts and warnings, and all of the filters that are on our network are looking at a finite amount of data, which is the information that's just in our network. So if we have 3 filters or 9 filters or 15 different filters between AV, firewall, IPSs, content filters, etc., the return on investment for adding yet another filter, looking at that existing set of data, is quite marginal. When you're able to bring in a new set of information, when you're able to add perspective to that data that you weren't able to see before, it actually takes all of those sensors and filters that you have on your network and makes them more effective, because they're not just spitting out flat red alerts across the board. you can take all the red alerts that are coming from your systems and you can prioritize them by what the rest of the world knows about what's going on your network. And that's highly critical for being able to respond quickly and being able to identify known malicious actors. I'll say that again. Known malicious actors. We're not finding people that were never known or never detected anywhere. What we're doing is cross-educating what we've each learned and detected somewhere so that we can take that low-hanging fruit off of the table where we can deal with those known malicious actors first. So we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. Does that mean all the attacks are gone? No. There'll still be people that are compromising brand new machines, coming up with new attacks, and coming after us in new ways. But we'll have more time and more resources to devote to finding those new attacks in those new directions if we can automate and we can share and avoid the duplicated work of dealing with that lower level rung of hackers. And that's really the best I think that sharing can come to is to force the hackers to compromise new machines every time. This process of using the same set of botnets again and again to attack different customers hundreds of times a week is something that as a society, as a community, we can defend ourselves against if we can find innovative ways like this to get over our privacy concerns and to be able to share information that's already out there and has already been exposed to the outside world already. So that's basically what I wanted to cover today. Are there any questions, comments?